Today, my name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA, and we are thrilled to have so many of you here today. Start off right off because I know a few of you mentioned, unfortunately, Cleet Willems had to cancel his appearance here at WITA today. This is a last-minute change. We did announce it in some email traffic yesterday as well on our website, but I'm sorry if you missed that. Cleet did say he hoped to come to speak to WITA again at a future time, and we hope to make that happen. We're thrilled today with the panel we have. Couldn't have four better people talking about the World Trade Organization, the issues about it, and the future of it. They're all good friends, people I've known personally for over 20 years in every case. Dorothy Dwoskin is a member of the WITA board, who's our moderator today, is a dear friend and a great help to all of us in everything we do at WITA. One of my go-to people for everything we plan and work on, and I'm very grateful always to you, Dorothy. Terry is a mentor of mine. He used to come see me on the Hill many, many years ago. Thank you again for joining us once again. Ron, we've worked together in various guises over many, many years, and I'm really grateful to have you, I think for the first time on a WITA panel. And Grant, yeah. Friend, mentor, guide, my favorite jazz musician, colleague. Very grateful to you as well. Thanks to everyone for coming today. We have a couple big events next week I want to bring to your attention. They're both EU-centric. We are hosting the EU ambassador, and we'll have a discussion about EU trade next Thursday. And on Friday, we're having a discussion with David Davis and another member of Parliament and other pro-Brexiteers on Friday morning. And we're going to be talking about the trade aspects of the Brexit. And if you decide you want to go to both events, we're severely discounting the tickets for the second event because they're both sort of related of a piece. So if you go on our website, you can purchase tickets for one or both of those events. And I want to also bring to your attention our Washington International Trade Conference. I'm going to be mentioning this at every WITA event from here on until January 29th when it takes place, but it's the next big thing in the trade community is our Washington International Trade Conference. It's going to be an all-day affair here in the Reagan Building. Plenary sessions, breakout sessions, and followed by a reception. There's information on it in your packets and on the WITA website, and we hope to have all of you both there, and if you'll consider your organization sponsoring the program, we'd be delighted. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dorothy, and thank you.
Thanks for the nice introduction for the panelists. I can just say, for my part, as a recovering trade negotiator now out of government for, 10 years, 12 years, that these folks are part of the go-to group of folks that I've had the pleasure to work with all my career. Terry would always kind of take me aside and say, this is what's really going on with this problem, and I think this is how you might want to think about solving it. It was always invaluable, and we're really grateful to have somebody like Terry who is always looking at the WTO and trying to make things better. What do I say about you, Ron? Ron and I were at USTR together.
Keep it clean.
Yeah, okay. No stories. You made a tremendous contribution while you were at USTR and Commerce, and we're lucky to have your brains thinking about this. And Grant, what do you say? Grant was a colleague at USTR, and I remember visiting him on the Hill when I had a really tough problem when I was in the WTO office, and he was always right there to try and help. I think he was sort of the model of a good relationship between the administration and the Congress in terms of consulting on tough issues. So he certainly knows a lot about the subject matter. So we're going to talk about WTO reform this morning. I went online a couple of days ago, and I really wasn't surprised, but this is a really new issue. The first thing that popped up on my Bing search was a lengthy article from our old friend Uri Dadush, written in 2009 about the urgency of WTO reform and saving the institution. So I think it's probably important to remind everybody that this is really not a new issue, and that creating the WTO and improving the institution, which was the GATT, is sort of an iterative process. today we want to focus on a number of points. I thought I would just kind of throw out a couple of questions that you can keep in mind as we go forward. First one is, do we really still need the WTO? I know that coming from where I've come from, that's a heretical thing for me to say, but it was created at a different time in history. What's the role of the U.S. given what's going on with the Canadians and the so-called friends of the system? Where's the business community? There really hasn't been this outcry of interest from the business community. What are the most pressing issues that the WTO really needs to deal with? There are a number of issues out there, most prominent being dispute settlement. Is this about China? Is this about something more? We are really lucky that Terry put out a paper yesterday that I believe is available on the WITA website. It's a really good tutorial about all of the issues I know he's going to talk about. Wanted to mention that there are a couple other things. The administration was lucky to have Dennis Shea at the Center for Strategic and International Studies a couple of weeks ago. It got a lot of attention, unfortunately, for a line that he made about making sure that people choose a lane. But if you go back and you look at what he had to say, there's a lot of meat there in terms of what the administration is looking for and his disruptively constructive approach. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Our friend Rita Hennig, the Cub reporter, has also put something on the WITA website. So there's lots of stuff out there, and we would encourage you to get the conversation really moving. So we have a couple of milestones, things to think about. The CPTPP, the TPP without the U.S. is going to go into force in the first quarter of next year. EU-Japan likely also in place. Meanwhile, the WTO marches on and is planning for its next ministerial in Kazakhstan in June of 2020. Before that, there's a small problem with the dispute settlement process and the appellate body, and what is it, December 10th, 2019? You've got a few disputes that are underway related to some of the national security investigations and potential more things going on, depending on what the administration does with autos between now and February. So those are all things that kind of frame the discussion about WTO reform. I'm going to pass it to Terry, who's going to talk about sort of what's been going on and the positions of various parties. Ron's been doing some pretty clever thinking about what's next, and Grant is going to give us sort of the international perspective and the political perspective now that the midterms are over. So Terry, take it away.
Thanks, Dorothy. It's good to be with all of you. Just kind of step back a few steps, and this kind of goes to the first question, whether you need the WTO at all, and you need to take a look at the tremendous changes that have occurred that have kind of created this kind of perfect storm where people are now actually talking about, do we need to reform the WTO to keep it afloat, keep it relevant, et cetera. And the first of that, obviously, is the dramatic change in the composition of global trade and who is doing the trade, the rise of an economy that does not actually comport with the rules of the WTO. After all, the GATT and the WTO were created by fairly similar economic systems. And so that is a big driver for the discord that is out there. The people are looking to see whether the system can be reformed to deal with. Second, you have enormous technological changes in terms of how trade is done, and the rules of the game are basically 20th century rules for a 21st century world. And so there has been a long discontent amongst certainly many industries that the rules simply have not kept pace. So that is the second force. Third, you have the loss of effective negotiation capabilities within the WTO. Now, there have been a few successes in the last couple of years, and there's some committee work that has been going on, but most people would view the negotiating function is at least on life support, if not largely dead. And that flows from a consensus-based type of approach, which has historically worked well with a much smaller group, at least of active members, than before you had a single undertaking in the other way around. You have kind of the atrophying of the utility of the committee process, which has largely been a transparency, understand what other people are doing, et cetera. You have very poor notification compliance by many countries, and in some areas such as subsidies, really unacceptable performance by major players in the system, one of whom happens to also be now the world's largest trading nation. So you have that, and then you have long-standing problems that the United States and others have identified with the dispute settlement system. Not that most people haven't viewed the dispute settlement system as working well in most cases, but a host of issues that have been out there, that have been raised by the Bush administration, been raised by the Obama administration, and continue to be raised by the Trump administration, but with a new twist, namely, in a system that works by consensus, the U.S. has often been frustrated by other countries choosing not to agree to a consensus. And so the U.S. is now blocking the appointment of appellate body reappointments or new members as they try to force reform in the dispute settlement system. So all of those forces have come together, and because the appellate body one is the one that comes up first, because under the dispute settlement understanding, you need 3 appellate body members to hear an appeal. We're down to 3. And on December 10, 2019, 2 of the remaining 3 second term expires. So that then basically takes us down to 1, which means that the appellate body at that point is not able to take new appeals, even if the Rule 15 issue of the appellate body treating former members as still eligible to handle cases to which they were assigned before their terms expired were to continue. So you have really the first hard date that has economic significance in the WTO system that is out there, and that is the December 10, 2019. And so for a long time, there was very little actual discussion of what should be done. But as we get closer to that date, what you have seen is that more and more countries are saying, hey, maybe we need to deal with the concerns that the U.S. has. Maybe we need to take a look at broader reforms. Maybe we need to deal with all of these issues that are out there. There were a series of initiatives announced down at the Buenos Aires Ministerial last year, and those are all kind of incorporated into it. So we have 2 think pieces that are out there. There was an EU paper that was put out in September, and then there was a Canadian paper that was teed up last month, basically in advance of the mini-ministerial that they had up in Ottawa, where there were 13 friends of the system gathered together to see whether there were a group of ideas that people agreed to that they would thought would make sense to go out and reach out to other countries to see if there could be a reform effort that moves forward. Interestingly, the issues that were in the EU paper and the Canadian paper largely reflect the types of issues that Dennis Shea reviewed that have been of major concern to the United States, and that the United States is looking for advancement in terms of reform in the system. I won't go through the details of the appellate body. There's been a lot of sessions on that. I'll be happy to answer questions on it. But there's already been one paper that was put out by the U.S., Europe, Japan, Argentina, and Costa Rica, and that went out last week, that looks at what possible reforms there could be in terms of improving notifications and improving consequences or increasing consequences if countries do not satisfy their obligations under the WTO to provide timely notification. So that one is out and kind of at least starting the process of gathering discussions. There's a trilateral initiative by the U.S., EU, and Japan to deal with the distortions that flow from a state-controlled system like China that has caused massive excess capacity, where you have state-owned enterprises that don't really operate under the rules, and where you have massive subsidization of excess capacity as a result. That hasn't yet appeared, but will likely appear not yet have formal proposals for dispute settlement resolution, but those will be coming. And obviously there is a plurilateral initiative that was started down in Buenos Aires on digital trade that the U.S. and others are actively pursuing. So with that, I'll stop and let
Ron, before you start, I just wanted to mention that the dispute settlement session that WITA did maybe 2.5 months ago is up on the website. So if you are confused about what's Rule 15 and some of the other issues, that's a very good place to start for a tutorial. Thanks.
So, good morning, everyone. I was thinking the other day, now why would Ken want me to participate in this session? And obviously it was mentioned that I spent a lot of time in my government career as a negotiator or a regular participant in the work at the WTO, and before that the Tokyo Round Code Committees. And when I was at USTR working with Dorothy, I had to make sure those ministerial conferences are going to be set up properly. But I think the real reason I was asked to participate here is in the context of that work and other work that I did in government. I was the unfair trade guy. I was the guy that dealt with disciplining unfair trade practices, trying to think of better rules to deal with them. And by unfair trade, I mean more broadly, what sort of government practices and policies distort the rules of the road in terms of optimal outcomes in an international trading system. So for me, why does the WTO matter? I look at it from the point of view that it's the most efficient way to maximize adherence to a single set of rules to deal with disciplines that affect trade. You can have experimental approaches in bilateral agreements and regional agreements that can help inform things, but if you really want sort of a baseline that's going to have to work for everyone, you need something like the WTO to provide that opportunity. So from my perspective, it is worth spending some time thinking about how to make it work better. So what would reform consist of? It seems to me there's two basic areas. One of them, as Terry has kind of laid out well, is how do you improve the functioning of the current system? And the second area is how do you update the scope and content of the agreements to reflect ongoing trade, production, and I'll dare say political developments. In terms of improving the functioning of the system, there have been 3 pillars that were supposed to be the underpinnings of the WTO's work: negotiation, implementation, and dispute settlement. And as Terry's mentioned, there's been a certain amount of atrophy with respect to negotiation and implementation, which has left all the weight of the system on dispute settlement with the obvious sort of tensions and outcomes there. But in some of the recent discussions I've heard about implementation, there's been a singular focus on monitoring and compliance, specifically with respect to notification obligations and the like. And I think that's important, and I applaud the efforts of certain members to think of ways to strengthen the notification and the transparency aspects of the WTO. But as Terry indicated, in my mind, implementation is both about domestic implementation and it's about implementation of the rules and the regular work of the committees and the bodies of the organization. And there's a need to figure out how to activate that in a more effective way. The WTO, in some sense, its success has been its undoing, because it's now such a large organization, and from my perspective, it's become more and more like UNCTAD every day than what the GATT used to be. So I'm not talking about how to make the GATT great again, but I do think we need to think about how to approach things so there's more engagement from capitals in the work of the organization, make it more relevant. And so, pardon the pun, but the administration breaking some China in the current context, to some degree, I think helps to create a situation where people will think about that again, and you can kind of see that from some of the proposals. Okay, so scope, content of the agreements. The elephant in the room is, as Terry mentioned, there's growing importance of what I'll describe as state-led economies. This has been something that the United States has pointed to as a leading motivation for its interest in seeking reform of the WTO. And we need to better clarify how they should be treated in an international system that's predicated on optimal market function. So the first thing that I think is that you can look at how do you strengthen existing rules that deal with government policies that tend to distort markets, and that certainly should be done. But you also need to think about, I'll take China as an example, but China's not the only example of this. Do you seek changes that would presumably incentivize or encourage those economies to become more market-oriented? Or do you recognize that, at least today, their policies are such that they don't intend to change their way of doing business? And so if they're going to be part of this organization that involve other market-driven economies, what rules do you need to make sure that the decisions they've made domestically to keep certain aspects of their system the way they are don't adversely affect their trading partners? It's sort of like the square peg fitting in a round hole. So I think that means that you kind of look at some of the threads of the ideology of the WTO to determine whether adjustments are appropriate. Now, I'm going to list a couple of things. I'm not saying I advocate these in terms of this should be the outcome, but I tried to think of what could be things that I think we need to be thinking about in terms of how to square that circle. So the first thing would be definitions. My recollection of the WTO is there's the old language from Article 6 that talked about, state-controlled economies, I believe it was. The old sort of Soviet model of economic organization. And then in the Uruguay round, at least in the subsidies agreement, you had this term called Economies and Transformation. And obviously that was a term that was devised at a time when the world had begun to change, and the belief and the evidence at that time was that there are a number of economies that are moving from the Soviet model to something different. They were still different from the market-oriented economies that sort of provided the basis for the organization's rules. So do we need new definitions now? Whether you look at Vietnam or China, I don't think you can legitimately say that they're just state-controlled, nor that they're economies in the process of transformation. There's something quite different, and I think that might mean that we need to think of what rules apply to that. So, in the context of a state-led economy, how do you look at the rules about government subsidies and supports and the like? In the US jurisprudence, subsidies were identified as a government intervention in contrast to how the market was organizing the economy. And I think it was in 2006 when the Commerce Department decided it could apply the countervailing duty law to imports from China. There was a certain amount of discussion about that enough change had occurred in China that those subsidies could be identified as being distinct from other forms of government involvement in the economy. That's 12 years ago now, and we've seen certain changes in China that seem to be going in the opposite direction. So I wonder, for example, if you look at dispute settlement and the controversy around the definition of public body that's in the subsidies agreement, many believe that that term was interpreted in an overly narrow fashion by the dispute settlement system. But might it be possible to look at it in a different way if that economy that's at issue is a state-led economy? And could that, in fact, actually make Canada begin to think more seriously about how to change some of those definitions in the subsidies agreement? I think we also need to be thinking about how to distinguish between state-led economies and developing economies. A lot of times, policies pursued by governments are in the name of both, if it's a certain country involved. But putting aside the whole issue of differentiation and what are the right rules for special and differential treatment, I think there's a certain amount of confusion that exists today between what a state-led economy is pursuing and what a developing economy is pursuing in terms of its development. and it's allowed state-led economies to hide under a veneer of special and differential treatment and developing country status that is no longer appropriate in my mind. Dorothy always laughs when I mention this, but if we're talking about how to reform the system to kind of better deal with some of the problems that arise, if you're talking about state-led economies, I would actually go back to that old debate from the 1990s about trade and competition policy. Obviously, my Chinese friends have developed a particular approach to antitrust law, which I think gives rise to questions about whether it's consistent with what my friends in the antitrust division think ought to be the way. But their approach of, positive comedy arrangements, I will say I think is kind of naive. And we need to look at, I'm not saying it's necessarily Kodak Fuji, but there are a number of things that spill out into the trade space that have to do with anti-competitive conduct that, particularly when you have the state heavily involved in the economy and state-owned enterprises, bears some closer examination. The next provocative point I'll throw out there has to do with this point I mentioned earlier about there may be certain things you have to recognize that you're not going to change about that state-led economy, but you still need a device to make sure that the decisions that they make don't adversely affect you. And I will go back to Article 23, nullification and impairment. I mean, that's been something that provides a basis, I think, for us to sort of say, we can't put our thumb exactly on what it is that you've done in combination of all your industrial policies that's tilted the playing field. But here's evidence that indicates how the decisions that you've made have led to this impairment of our expectations of what we get from the trade agreement. It would be hard, it would take a lot of work, but I think it's worth looking at. And then I would say beyond strictly speaking state-led economy issues, we could look at other updates that aren't totally unrelated. Do we need more extensive subsidy and unfair trade disciplines to be applicable to trade and services? Is there a need to restructure anti-dumping and countervailing duty rules to better reflect the reality of global supply chains, the prevalence of multinational competitors having production facilities situated across multiple jurisdictions, and the reasonableness of price and cost data in circumstances where those data points aren't fully reflective of an undistorted market? All tough issues. I'm not saying that you could do it in 5 days. But if we're going to reform the system to deal with some of these SLE, state-led economy problems, we should also take advantage of the opportunity to kind of look at the details across the range of agreements. The last thing I wanted to say is if we go about this, I think there's an argument to be made for reconsidering the founding principles. It was striking to me when I went back to the preamble for the GATT, for the General Agreement, and for the agreement establishing the WTO. There's a certain amount of implicit assumption about we all know what the norm should be, but it's not called out in any specific language. There is talk about the GATT and the WTO are intended to help achieve such goals as raised living standards, increased employment, expanded income and demand, growing production and trade in goods and services. And over time, there have been additional aspirations added having to do with sustainable and optimal use of global resources and ensure that developing countries benefit from the growth of international trade in a manner commensurate with